Welcome everybody to the closing conference of the Jean Monnet Network EUCROSS, the European Union at the Crossroads of Global Order. Our topic of today is Contestation and Polarization in Global Governance, European Responses in Post-Corona Times. The conference today is going to look into three different panels, and in fact I try to switch my slides here to the next one, but I failed to do so. So I hope that you can see the first panel right now. And the first panel is actually a panel where we are going to look into questions of cooperation, of polarization, of contestation from different active perspectives, from the perspective of different international actors. And it's a great pleasure that we have this first panel here in the morning with us. Our chair, 𝗕𝗿𝗀𝗀𝗃𝗲, will say a little bit more about this first panel in a second. In the afternoon, we are going to have a second panel. Perhaps we can go to the next slide. That second panel is going to start at 2:30 European time and is focusing on the European contributions to global governance, understanding the EU's strategizing, legitimization, and policy making in times of crisis. There again, we have colleagues from various places around the world with us, but also experts from the European Union and the United Nations. And finally, we have, in fact, this afternoon at 5 o'clock, the keynote lecture by 𝗕𝗿𝗀𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃 from American University on the new Biden administration and its potential effect on global governance and cooperation in these challenging times. Now, with that being said, I would like to basically give you a little introduction into our project. The project is a project that we have been applying for 4 years ago, after actually the European global strategy came out, and anticipating actually the first moves of the Trump administration. And as you basically all know, it has been quite some challenging times in terms of contestation, polarization, and I may say so not only because of the change of the United States as a superpower, as basically as some would say, a hegemon within the liberal international order, but also because of various other challenges, polarization moves, contestation from various actors around the world, but also from a European perspective, because of the growing contestation within. As you know, the European Union has been going through various crises over the last decade, to name only the financial crisis, the migration crisis, a security crisis, crisis of terrorism within the European Union, and obviously lately, like so many other regions around the world, Europe has also been facing the COVID-19 crisis. With that in mind, we have been observing, we have been trying to think about what is actually happening to global order. What are the challenges? What are, in fact, the actors that push globalization on the one hand, that push for global governance on the one hand, and what are the actors that are seeking, let's say, alternative ways of cooperation, sometimes challenging the established liberal international order. So from the beginning, EUCROSS, our Jean Monnet network, was in a unique position because we had so many partners from all around the world with us, and many of you are here in our concluding conference today as well. To name, in fact, Queen Mary University of London, the University of Florida, 𝗥𝗂𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 Global University, Jagiellonian University in Krakow, the Raoul Wallenberg Institute in Sweden, the German Institute of Development, the Institute for World Economy and International Relations in Moscow, Russia, the American University in Washington, D.C., and the University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. All these partners have been teaming up. We had conferences, which seem so long ago, in Hong Kong. 𝗕𝗿𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 is chairing our first panel today, where we looked especially into questions of contestation, polarizations in the area of global trade and investment, and then a follow-up conference a year later in 2019 at Washington, D.C., at American University, where we were looking into the broader spectrum beyond contestation in global trade and investment, also looking into areas of security, of human rights, the rule of law, and of environmental global governance. These issues have been with us throughout the whole Jean Monnet network, and at the same time, obviously, a lot has been happening in Europe itself. Only over the last year, perhaps accelerating because of COVID-19, we have been seeing ample joint communications by the European Commission, by the High Representative of the Common Foreign and Security Policy, to basically lay the ground for new strategic thinking, for new initiatives of trying to assume how to react to a global order that has been tremendously challenged, but also changed over the last couple of months and years. And I think it is very timely now to have our two panels of today to think about how international actors are anticipating the change, the global change that we are currently witnessing on the one hand, but also to think about how the European Union, how cooperation with the European Union and cooperation because of the European Union, both bilaterally and multilaterally, can lead to the way of cooperation which we may see from now on in the future. What will be the great challenges? What will be the way forward? For example, multilateralism. How do we pair interests, values, and principles? How are we going to cooperate on specific issues while we are so far away from each other, far away from agreement with regards to others? How can we make sense of cooperation in a world that seems to be more divided, if I may say so, than ever? At the same time, and we have to also take that into account, we know that within the United States there is a tremendous change going on, and throughout the panels, I guess, we will hear about what that administration change will mean, both for the European Union, but also for other actors like Russia, like China, and others around the world with regards to global governance, with regards to international cooperation. I've talked too long. I have given you a little bit of an introduction to EUCROSS. It's a pity that we are already concluding our Jean Monnet network, but I'm so much looking forward to these concluding panels and also to the keynote later this evening. So welcome everybody, and I give the floor to 𝗕𝗿𝗀𝗀𝗃𝗲𝗀, who will chair the first panel.
Thank you very much, 𝗕𝗿𝗀𝗀𝗃𝗲𝗀. So, hello everyone, and good evening from Hong Kong. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you all and share this conference first session, which has been titled From Polarization and Contestation to Cooperation and Global Governance in Times of Crisis. I understand from the organizers that this session will discuss the specific features of polarization and contestation by using an international actor perspective, focusing on the ambitions and objectives of key players in global governance. So this panel, this session will in particular discuss key counterparts of the EU in the world and answer many questions, but in particular the question as for how these actors position themselves towards cooperation and global governance in various issue areas. It's a rich panel that we have. As all speakers' profiles are available on the conference website, I will, and please don't take offense about this, I will keep my introductory remarks as brief as possible so that we can focus on substance. Let me just say that each of the 5 panelists focuses on one actor. So the first speaker will be Professor Mike Smith, will focus on the US, while Professor Nadia Arbatova, who is the second speaker, will focus on Russia. Professor Matthieu Burnay and Professor Svartman will focus respectively on China and then Brazil. And finally, our 5th and last speaker, Dr. Hivonnet, will focus on West Africa. I also understand, I did not mention that, but next to the focus on the respective actors, which I've mentioned, I'm sure our panelists will also discuss how these actors regard and engage in cooperation with the EU towards various global governance areas. Let me just remind everyone that each speaker will have a maximum of 15 minutes for her or his presentation. I'll try to enforce that as strictly as possible. In terms of organization, since we have 5 speakers, I feel it would be a bit frustrating to wait the end of the session to ask questions. Also, I realize that if we have Q&As after each presentation, time management may become an issue, and that will lead the last speaker to speak quite late. So in light of this, and as a matter of fairness, I suggest a very simple organization. We are going to have the first 3 presentations following the order of the program. And after these first 3 presentations, we'll have a Q&A session focusing on these 3 presentations. So the little Q&A break will be after Professor Burnay's presentation. Of course, if you have any questions, comments during the first 3 presentations, you know that you can use the chat box. The authors, the speakers might want to answer the questions in writing in the chat box, or if they can't or don't see, I will collect the questions and put them forward during the Q&A. So do not hesitate to use the chat box during the presentations. It's in fact very convenient. And after this little Q&A, we'll go back to the remaining 2 speakers. And again, after that, we'll have a Q&A. Okay, hopefully that will make things more interactive, easier to follow, and more enjoyable for everybody. All right. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Mike Smith from Warwick University. Mike will talk about US, and more precisely, he will compare, he will contrast multilateral diplomacy pursued by the EU with the US transactional diplomacy to see whether new initiatives from both the EU and the US announce a kind of renaissance of global governance. So, Mike, up to you now. Mike, you are muted. You should unmute. That's good now. We can hear you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now we can see your screen. Perfect.
Okay. Yeah. Seems to default to mute in a way that is untypical of other formats. Okay. Thanks very much for the introduction and the introduction to the EUCROSS project. As you can see from my title, I'm actually not going to focus 100% on the United States because I think one of the key issues for me to discuss is the way in which the United States and the European Union relate to each other, because both the United States and the European Union in recent pronouncements have seen themselves as the absolute key to a revitalization of global governance. So I want to interrogate that kind of position in the light of work that I've been doing on EU and US diplomacy, and also other work that I've done on the ways in which the EU and the US relate to global governance. So it's not just about the US, rather it contrasts the EU and the US positions and their practices, and it in a way asks just how different they are, and asked how positive the prospects for a new transatlantic initiative in global governance might be. So what I'm going to talk about is this. I'm going to say something briefly about, and this is based on work that's forthcoming, about multilateralism and transactionalism as approaches to global governance, and as approaches that you might say are typified by the EU and the US over the last 4 years, but I'll be asking some questions about that as well. Then I'm going to talk about the ways in which EU and US approaches have come together or not come together, and the ways in which global governance, for a variety of reasons, might be seen as being under siege over the last 4 years, and not least, of course, from the United States. And then say something about current prospects and about some of the recent initiatives, cascade of initiatives from the EU and the US in the light of the prospects for global governance in a more general sense. And in a way, one of the things I'm struck by about the current relationship between the EU and the US is the ways in which it resembles and the ways in which it doesn't resemble the first steps of the Obama administration in 2009. And the reason I say that is because we have very large expectations of the United States and of the influence of a Biden administration, not so much as to call it Obama Mark III, but high expectations, and the question is whether those expectations are justified and whether the United States will find it easy to actually fulfill those expectations, or whether it actually wants to fulfill those expectations. And this is where the ideas of contestation and polarization come in for me, because they help us to see where we've been over the last 4 years and more, and also where we might be going in terms of global governance and the EU's and the US's roles in global governance. So here's a contrast, and of course it's a contrast between two sort of archetypes, so it doesn't represent necessarily anything that corresponds to either EU or US policy. But I've tried to contrast here a multilateral approach to global governance and then the impact of transactionalism on approaches to global governance. And as you can see, I mean, I'm not saying anything particularly new here. It's been said many times in many ways over the last 4 years and beyond. But just worth thinking about it in terms of the other things we're going to be discussing today. Multilateralism depends absolutely on the idea of embedded institutions and rules, on convergent values, on diffuse reciprocity, in which over the long term and over many issues, things work to the benefit of all, on trust, on the idea of negotiated order, in other words, that you can negotiate your way through global governance and the implementation of institutions and agreements. There's a focus on process, because it's a process rather than an end state that we're talking about here. The process itself embodies the use of linkages between issues, of leverage across issues, and learning by the participants. And the end state, the aim, is some sort of comprehensive or overall coherent approach to issues of global governance. Now, on the other side, contrasting that with transactionalism, and I'm not saying here that this is Donald Trump in disguise, but I am saying that it obviously, in the recent situation, the EU finds itself on the multilateral end of the spectrum, and the United States has found itself on the transactional end of the spectrum. Transactionalism, for me, is focused on power and the use of power and assets. It's based on specific reciprocity rather than diffuse reciprocity. In other words, here's an issue, who's going to win and who's going to lose, or who's going to come out on top and who's going to suffer the losses in a particular area. It's based on suspicion rather than trust. Don't trust your partners, even if they say they're your eternal allies. It's based on the art of the deal. Of course, that is a phrase from Trumpism. And the ways in which the deals can be constructed. In appreciating those deals, the idea of cost effectiveness, in other words, getting the most for the least for each actor, is important. The focus is on results rather than process. It tends, and it certainly was under Trump, to be piecemeal and contradictory. And the end state, in principle at least, is decoupling, disruption, and unpredictability. In other words, something that people might say is the antithesis of some sort of effective global governance. Now, what I'm not saying is that either the EU or the US corresponds exactly to either of these things. What I am saying is that these are archetypes and there's a spectrum. And it's quite possible to conceive of mixed cases. There's a kind of transactional multilateralism, which would be quite difficult to sustain, but actually becomes part of the context of global governments. These elements coexist, they can overlap, they can overlay each other, and there's a fluctuating balance between them. It is clear, as I said, that the EU and the US under the last 4 years have been at different points on this spectrum. And one of the questions is exactly where the United States will be on this spectrum in the next 4 years. The next slide talks about global governance under siege, and it's intended to put a little bit more flesh on the bones of what I've just said. When it comes to the European Union, we've seen over the last few years and subsequent to the global strategy and some of its later modifications, the idea of strategic autonomy and the search for strategic autonomy. And I'm not going to talk very much about this because we know other people will talk about it later. But it's important to my argument that there's a tendency, or has been a tendency, to start to see the EU as a power in a multipolar system, amongst other powers and that there's a competition for models of global governance between those powers. And that's not just with the US, it's also with China and Russia and others. Within the EU, there have been internal challenges to the liberal order, as Collier indicated earlier on. And this has had a polarizing impact within the EU, the impact of what people have called illiberal democracy. And one of the things that the EU has experienced over a few years is a rather ambivalent set of responses to challenges to the rules-based order. And that reflects in many ways the kind of crises that Collier talked about earlier. The financial crisis, the migration crisis, the crisis of democracy in the EU, and most recently, of course, the COVID crisis. Now, on the other side, the Trump administration proclaimed America first and pursued that policy in effect, in terms of global governance, by downgrading institutions and rules. The World Trade Organization, stymieing and paralyzing in many ways the World Trade Organization, the Paris Accords and its defection from those, NATO itself and the demands from the United States that others play their part, which in part were successful, but created an atmosphere in NATO and between the EU and the US where the European countries were seen as foes rather than as allies. And of course, most recently, the World Health Organization under the impact of the COVID crisis. The Trump administration also promoted a kind of sequential bilateralism and, as I said earlier, the deal-making approach to US foreign policy, most obviously through things not very successfully, perhaps, like the relationship with North Korea and various other authoritarian regimes around the globe. One of the consequences of this and of these two processes in the EU and the US is that polarization has taken place not just at the domestic level, it has, not just at the international level, it has, but at both at the same time. And both within the EU and the US, you've seen this impact of polarization and the potential growth of alternative models for multilateralism and global governance coming from China and elsewhere. So the result of this is a crisis of multilateralism of global governance, and it has domestic, transnational, and global dimensions. We can talk more about that in questions, perhaps. So if we're going to get out of this, where are we going to go? The EU has staked its current policies on blending assertiveness with multilateralism. For example, by promoting a trade policy described as open strategic autonomy. I'll be interested to hear how people respond to that later. Growth of conditionality and of what Richard Youngs and I have called contingent multilateralism in EU policies. Now, okay, so far so fine, but the question is, how does this match up with the EU's commitment to multilateralism and to the EU's response to issues like the COVID crisis, the migration crisis, and elsewhere? And how does it cope with the growth of geopolitics in the global arena, epitomized perhaps by relations between the United States and various countries, but also the relationships of larger powers as a whole? With the Biden administration, the United States is back, as he said many times now, but it's a very qualified return to multilateralism. This is a multilateralism in which a lot of the Trump legacy still persists. It's not multilateralism as it relates to China, for example. China is perhaps the great question that both the EU and the US becomes difficult. The United States is back, but there's an assumption in a lot of what Joe Biden has said, for example, at the Munich Security Conference. I'll stop it just. I can't hear. I can't hear that.
Sorry, Mike, it was just an interference. So please, you can carry on.
Okay, I'll be done in a couple of minutes. So the Biden administration, you need to look at what version of multilateralism is being re-espoused here, and what version of international cooperation is being re-espoused. Everybody is glad, in a way, that the United States is back, but which United States is it? Is it a United States whose leadership and its credibility is undermined by the legacy of the Trump administration? And there's been a lot of comment on that in recent days. So we have two initiatives that have taken place, and I want to talk about them 30 seconds each. The EU's initiative, the EU-US Agenda for Cooperation. Now, what is this? We might ask ourselves, and we'll probably find ourselves discussing this afternoon. Is it a plan for renewal of global governance in general? A play for recognition by the US as a partner in leadership? Or an attempt to constitute an EU-US bi-multilateral end run in which the EU and the US come together and in some way manage to exert some form of hegemony over approaches to global governance in the next few years? I leave those questions open. The US initiative, parallel perhaps, amongst others, is Joe Biden's call for a summit of democracies. But exactly what is this? Is it a geopolitical ploy against China, Russia, others? A reassertion of US leadership in the so-called D10? Or is it, and maybe it's all of these things, a minilateral plan, a small group, likely to exacerbate contestation and division? I think I'm not going to say any more because I'm out of time, but the likely outcome here, to me, is a continued challenge of contestation and polarization, not least because of the legacy of the last 4 years, at the transatlantic and the global level, and challenges, therefore, to the legitimacy and capacity of global governance, perhaps from within the transatlantic area, but also from outside. Finished.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'll be happy to come back with you in the Q&A on this interaction between domestic US politics and their ramifications at the international level, in particular with respect to the Biden's announcement to favor Buy American. I'll come back on that in the Q&A. But in any case, thank you very much for giving such a very inspiring and insightful presentation. So let's move on to our second speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Nadia Arbatova from the Institute for World Economy and International Relations. Nadia will discuss the role of Russia in the processes of contestation and polarization in the world arena. So Nadia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes.
Very well, thank you.
Thank you. Probably I misunderstood the topic of my presentation because I thought that it should be about a Russian view on the EU relations with the main power centers in the post-pandemic world. But I'll try to cover all topics. Let me start with two preliminary remarks. The year 2020 left us with the devastating results of the coronavirus pandemic. To date, the main question that gnaws at the minds of politicians, businessmen, and academics is whether the international community will be able to overcome the COVID-19 destruction and move further towards a better world, or it is doomed to come to terms with the so-called new normal, which is essentially not normal at all. However, this question creates only a general context within which more concrete problems and challenges exist. The COVID, if we're speaking about European Union, the COVID-19 pandemic broke out shortly after the new leadership of the European Union outlined an ambitious agenda for European integration aimed at upgrading the EU role in the international relations. The EU emergence as a full-fledged power center built on liberal democracy, the rule of law, responsible development, and shared sovereignty could significantly contribute to greater stability in the international relations. Because in the pre-pandemic world, there was only one full-fledged power center. It was the United States. China was approaching these standards. European Union and Russia presented two different models. The EU was economic power center, while Russia was a military power center. The pandemic dealt a heavy blow to all power centers. And if we speak about multilateral cooperation and Russia's position on multilateral cooperation, I could say that Russia is not against multilateral cooperation, but it has its own understanding of what multilateral cooperation means. Russia, after the collapse of the USSR, is obsessed with two things: sovereignty and equality. So for Russia, multilateral cooperation means equality, to be on par with other power centers. We know that pandemic changed a lot of things in our everyday life. It has claimed many lives in different parts of the world. But as for the level of world politics, the pandemic became not so much a game changer, but rather a catalyst for the trends that already existed before. And it did not contribute to the solidarity, or better to say, to multilateral cooperation of the United States, European Union, Russia, and China in front of this invisible enemy. Just on the contrary, it exacerbated old tensions. The international rivalry has affected even the healthcare sector, where national vaccine competition has reached unprecedented proportions. Moreover, the pandemic was used by the parties to incite political and ideological confrontation. And the latest G20 summit, full of fair appeals and very good expectations, did not bring the participants' positions closer. Let me now address the EU-Russia relations. In my view, they have never been as bad as they are now. And the recent visit of Josep Borrell to Moscow was the best evidence to the poor state of the bilateral relations. The parties not only failed to find common ground, but even more rigidly staked out the irreconcilability of their positions. Moscow opposes the interference of the European Union in its internal affairs, and it is even ready to break off relations with the European Union, which, however, remains Russia's main partner, economic partner. Brussels introduces new sanctions in connection with the so-called Navalny case and the suppression of political protests, criticizes Russia's position on the conflict in eastern Ukraine, but at the same time, it shows its readiness for selective cooperation with Moscow on the most urgent international problems. The Ukraine conflict, which led to Russia's incorporation of Crimea, the sanctions war, and to the freezing of bilateral cooperation, is widely viewed as a crucial moment in the rapid degradation of the EU-Russia relations. However, the real roots of the current crisis are much deeper and related to the differing views of Russia and the EU and the West at large about the acceptable foundations of the post-bipolar security and rivalry in the post-Soviet space. And it is in my view, it's very important to understand the origins of the current crisis, because we cannot move further in our multilateral cooperation and interaction if we don't understand the origins of this crisis. So the different views on the acceptable foundations of European security and rivalry in the post-Soviet space. You remember that the Ukraine conflict was triggered by the clash of two different regional strategies, Eastern Partnership and Russia's Eurasia economic project. In addition, both Russia and European Union have very different understanding of Russia's European identity, which surprisingly was reconfirmed recently by President Putin when in his speech in Davos. I was really surprised because for many years our leadership did not talk about Russia's European identity, but our Eurasian identity. So for Kremlin, Russia's European identity means that it is a sovereign, equal partner of Europe, and the latter should not interfere in Russia's internal affairs and preach to Kremlin. For the European Union, Russia's European identity means, first of all, its compliance with European democratic norms and principles. And in my view, the EU is trying to combine in its policy vis-à-vis Russia two parallel courses: sanctions, pressure, and selective cooperation when it is needed. But in politics, unlike geometry, two parallel lines can intersect. Neither Russia nor European Union is interested in breaking off relations. However, resetting these relations in the current situation is not possible. So we cannot speak about full-fledged multilateral cooperation. The maximum that one can hope for is selective interaction in a very narrow corridor of opportunities. Generally speaking, these relations will combine both pragmatic pinpoint cooperation and fierce rivalry at the regional and global levels. I would like to say a few words how we see the Euro-Atlantic relations in Russia. If I have time. Uda?
Yes, you do. 5 minutes.
Thank you. How we see the situation in the EU-US relation. Well, we think that the pandemic did what the American liberals could not do. It made Trump leave. And it would not be an exaggeration to say that the COVID-19 provided Joe Biden's victory. And in our view, this in itself leaves Europeans as well as liberals in the United States with a bitter aftertaste. What would have happened if it hadn't been for the pandemic? And can European allies rely on the country where 𝗕𝗵𝗶𝗃𝗀𝗃 remains a powerful political force? Of course, Biden will change the tone and the form of American foreign policy, and such things matter in diplomacy. However, even in the best case scenario of Euro-Atlantic relations, Europe will continue to be viewed as an instrument for achieving the US goals. Many traditional Atlantists in Europe believe that Biden will return the Euro-Atlantic relations to status quo ante. And in my view, it is impossible by definition, because status quo ante refers to the Cold War era when European security dependent on the United States. So as it's in Moscow, neither Biden nor anyone else will change the EU drive for strategic autonomy. Well, I don't know whether I have already extended my time, because I have many topics, the EU-China relations and the regional hegemons like Turkey. Probably I have already expanded my time, but I would like to conclude with the question for tomorrow. With the spread of the pandemic, of the two eternal Russian questions, who is to blame and what to do, the second came to the fore. What to do in order to cope with the devastating impact of the coronavirus? Nonetheless, when figuratively speaking, the post-COVID dust settles down, the second question will arise. Who is to blame? Why did the world learn about the COVID-19 so late? Why was the COVID-19 outbreak in China officially recognized only on December 31st? But the first case was registered in November. And why did the World Health Organization announce the pandemic only in March? All world leaders in all countries, Russia, European Union, China, the United States, will inevitably face this question. And the answer to this question can affect international relations and multilateral cooperation as much as the pandemic itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadia. So on behalf of everyone here, I'd like to thank you for an interesting presentation. There'll be questions and comments, I'm sure. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our third speaker for today, Matthieu Burnay of Queen Mary University. So Matthieu should in principle focus on China. Correct me if I'm wrong, Matthieu, but that's the agenda that was given. Before you take over, Matthieu, let me just remind everybody that after Matthieu's presentation, we will have a short Q&A. So you can discuss with our three first presenters and raise any questions you may have on US, Russia, China, and the EU, of course. Matthieu, you have the floor.
Many thanks, Professor 𝗕𝗫, for your kind introduction. Just before I get started, just would like to make sure that you can see my slides and hear me properly.
It's perfect, Matthieu.
It's perfect. Excellent. Thank you very much, Julien. So many thanks to the organizers for this very kind invitation to talk about a topic on which several PhD dissertations could potentially be written. So needless to say that I've been kind of forced into picking and selecting a few issues, which I would like to present to you today, indeed, from the so-called Chinese perspective. My presentation will be divided into three main parts. I mean, in the first part, I would like indeed to emphasize the fact that the party state, as they will call it, is very much at a turning point, not only internally, but also externally, against the background of this crisis of the liberal international order, which has already been discussed today. Then I would like to try to describe, I mean, the ways in which China, I mean, tries to make sense of that momentum. And in that sense, I would like to describe what appears to be the so-called new era, which has been called by Xi Jinping in 2017, a new era which I will characterize internally as being characterized by an authoritarian revival in China, but which also has a new era, which also has massive implications in terms of China's foreign policy and engagement with global governance. And here I would like indeed to say a few words about China's attempts to enhance its discourse power and to describe the ways in which China has engaged with international law recently. Then as I was asked also to look into specific areas of global governance, I've tried to pick and choose two areas which are particularly relevant from the perspective of EU-China relations. And here I would like to say a few words about the Comprehensive Agreement on Investments, which was concluded in principle, I quote, between the EU and China in December 2020. And then I would like to say a few words about the engagement, the relationship between the EU and China in the area of international human rights, with a particular focus on recent events which have unfolded in the context of the UN Human Rights Council after the last UPR of China back in 2018. So this is a little bit the menu for my short presentation here. And again, as a kind of a first argument, which I would like to put forward, is this idea of the party state being very much at a turning point. I mean, Xi Jinping talked about socialism with Chinese characteristics entering a new era back in 2017. But when thinking critically about it, it's very clear that the party and the Chinese state are very much at a turning point. I mean, internally, there are a number of issues which require an urgent response from the party state. These challenges range from the relationship between economics and politics, or question of SOEs, the high level of income inequality and economic disparities, which have only been increasing in recent years in the PRC, but also all the implications of what is an increased concentration of power since Xi Jinping came into power back in 2013. Then there is obviously this question of what China shall make out of this so-called crisis of the post-World War II liberal international order. Here, it seems to be very clear that China recognizes the fact that there is a momentum, that there is an opportunity for China to seize against the background of this crisis of legitimacy of the international liberal order, crisis of legitimacy which has both an institutional and normative dimension, with not only the key international organizations such as the WTO, such as the UN and the UNSC in particular, being contested, but also indeed a strong normative dimension with the very values at the heart of this liberal international order, from the rule of law to human rights to democracy, which are not only contested from the outside by states such as Russia, China, and others, but also, as it was mentioned by Mike Smith in his presentation, also very much from the inside, if you think about situations of rule of law backsliding in states such as Poland or Hungary. And obviously then there is also the effectiveness aspect of this crisis, which provides China again with a kind of momentum and opportunity to engage with global governance in a different way. So when thinking about this new era, I first would like to say a few words about the internal dimension. Indeed, if you want to understand the ways in which China engages with global governance and with international law, it is very important to recognize that China has changed and has changed tremendously in recent years, and in particular since Xi Jinping came into power back in 2013. This change has been described as an authoritarian revival, the end of an era, a third revolution. I mean, you can find different ways to characterize those changes under Xi Jinping. So here, let me just mention a few symptoms or a few illustrations which I think testify to this changing domestic governance environment in China. The first element which I would like to mention here is the increased concentration of power, which has characterized China's governance since 2013. Best illustration thereof is indeed the amendment of the constitution of the PRC back in 2018, which no longer limits the terms of Chinese presidents to 2 mandates, but indeed giving the possibility to Xi Jinping to stay for a third or even more mandates. But then indeed what I would like to call the repartization of Chinese politics, not to say that the Chinese Communist Party had disappeared at any points under Hu Jintao, under Jiang Zemin, but definitely what we've seen is a return of the party to the forefront of Chinese politics. There's been also very much a shrinking space for contestation domestically. You can think here of the adoption of a number of laws which aim to protect China's national interests. You can also think of China's growing vocal opposition against the promotion of universal values, which has translated into a massive crackdown against any kind of human rights activism since 2015, the so-called 709 crackdown against human rights lawyers. In recent years, we've seen also, in the last 4 years, we've also seen some developments which testify to these ongoing changes. And here, obviously, I would like to refer to developments which have taken place in Xinjiang since 2017, with the establishment of those re-education/detention camps in the northwestern province of Xinjiang, but also more recently, obviously, the adoption of the Hong Kong national security law, which introduces broadly defined crimes of secession, subversion, and collusions with foreign countries, which do not only testify to the changing relationship between the mainland and Hong Kong in terms of a challenge to the one country, two systems principle, but which also has a tremendous impact on the very relationship between the autonomous administrative region of Hong Kong on the one side and the rest of the world on the other. This is for the internal dimension. Then obviously in terms of the external dimension, it is very clear that in this new era of Xi Jinping, that the old mantra of Deng Xiaoping to keep a low profile in foreign policy has been very much abandoned. This was true pre-COVID. It will be even more relevant post-COVID. China has also been very keen, the party state has also been very keen to enhance its discourse power, using itself, I mean, a Foucault type of language, with indeed this kind of commitment of China to shape norms, to shape international norms increasingly, and to shape the language which is used in international relations. The best example thereof is obviously the Belt and Road Initiative, which is this narrative. I'm not saying here strategy on purpose, but this narrative that China has presented to the rest of the world. And the least that can be said is that China has been quite successful in imposing this language and imposing this narrative. If you think just in the context of the EU-China dialogue on connectivity, it is very clear that China has been largely able to set the agenda in that regard. This departure from Deng Xiaoping's mantra, these attempts to enhance China's discourse power, have had a clear impact on the ways in which China engages with international law. It is very clear that China is no longer a norm taker in global governance. By norm taker, we are referring here to a state that would just take norms and not really try to change them. This was very much the perspective of China in the early years 2000s, for instance, when China joined the WTO. But what we've seen in recent years is indeed this shift towards China becoming increasingly not only a norm maker, but also increasingly a norm shaker of global governance. In terms of China being a norm maker, I would like to refer in particular to the recent establishment of a number of organizations under the Belt and Road Initiative. You can obviously think of the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, but also about the so-called judicialization of the Belt aspects of the Belt and Road Initiative with the establishment of international commercial courts under the umbrella of the Supreme People's Court of the People's Republic of China. But you can indeed think of China's activism in proposing new norms. This is, for instance, very clear in the area of cyberspace governance, with China coming up with this concept of cyberspace sovereignty, which is still very much ill-defined in a certain way, but which, if you like, signifies the fact that China indeed wants to protect itself against foreign interference in the area of internet and cyber governance, generally speaking, but also the fact that China wants to shift from a corporate-driven development of cyberspace to a very much state-driven dynamic where the party state should play a key role. A norm maker, but also increasingly a norm shaker, where China affirms that it has some core interests which are non-negotiable. I mean, this was very clear, for instance, at the time of the South China Sea dispute, where China, put in place this so-called non-participatory participation in the arbitral proceedings before the Court of Arbitration in The Hague. And China made it very clear at the time that its position on the South China Sea was really non-negotiable, and not hesitating in that sense to very much overturn or challenge the pre-established order of in the area of global maritime governance. And a point which I would also like to mention here, and as you can see, I put it between this idea of China being a norm maker and China being a norm shaker. It is this idea of China endorsing on a regular basis a minority position in the interpretation of international law, with China indeed proposing distinctive readings of the dominant rules, or indeed advocating for the formal revision of those rules. And in certain circumstances, you may categorize those minority positions as being China acting as a norm maker, but in some circumstances, and this is very much the case in the area of the international law of the sea, these minority positions do rather testify to this idea of China being a norm shaker. So this is what I wanted to tell you in terms of China's changing about Xi Jinping new era in both its internal and external dimension. Now, I just would like to say a few words on on two areas of global governance, which are obviously particularly relevant for EU-China relations. First of all, and to the surprise of many, including myself, I must confess, we had this Christmas gift, in December 2020, when the European Commission indeed announced the conclusion in principle of the so-called Comprehensive Agreement on Investments, which is aimed to replace, the 26 existing VITs between EU member states and the People's Republic of China. When I say caught by surprise, because I think many of us following the negotiations were thinking that that the Commission of Ursula von der Leyen would not be able to stick to this deadline of the end of December 2020. But apparently the power transition in the US has, among many other factors, indeed pushed both actors to conclude an agreement in principle earlier than expected. A few words on this agreement. First of all, we are talking about an agreement which is likely to be only ratified in the course of 2022. Very importantly on that point, we are talking about an agreement which will fall under the exclusive competence of the European Union, meaning that it will only have to receive a qualified majority vote in the Council of the EU, and it will have to meet simple majority in the European Parliament. The reason I'm saying this is, again, because the expectation was for this agreement to be a mixed agreement which would indeed include a robust, a dispute resolution mechanism, or which could also have potentially included indirect investments. But indeed, because this agreement does not include any mechanism of any investment protection mechanism in the form of ISDS or in the form of an investment court system, we are talking here about an agreement which will not have to be ratified by national parliaments or by subnational parliaments, as it has been the case of a number of comprehensive trade agreements which the EU has adopted recently with Vietnam, but also, for instance, with Canada. So I've already said a few words on this kind of first very striking point, that is the fact that there is no indeed robust dispute resolution mechanism included in the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. There is this idea that the EU and China will give themselves some time to find an agreement on the dispute resolution mechanism, but at the moment, both actors will have still to rely to a large extent on the existing dispute resolution mechanisms that exist in national BITs, between EU member states and the PRC. Another point which is quite important to make here relates to the right of states to regulate and norms diffusion. The EU has been, to a certain extent, successful indeed in making reference to those non-investment protection related provisions in the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. I mean, reference is made to human rights in the preamble, obviously cannot be legally enforced. On sustainability, there is an interesting commitment to implement the Paris Agreement. And on labor rights, a reference is made to the continued and sustained efforts that both sides should take to pursue ratification of the fundamental ILO conventions. What does it tell us about the future of global investment governance? It makes it very clear on the one side that the future of ISDS, ICS, or even a multilateral investment court is very uncertain. On the one side, it would be, and it is very difficult for the European Union to sell to its member state the idea of old-style ISDS. And on the other side, it appears very difficult for the European Union indeed to promote its revised or reformed version of ISDS in the format of the investment court system, as it has been established, for instance, in the trade agreement and investment agreement de facto with Vietnam and Canada. If I have time, Julien, may I say a few words about human rights and the UN Human Rights Council? I'm aware of the time here, but...
Can you do that in not more than 2 minutes, Matthieu?
I can definitely give it a try, Julien, and I will try my best, promise you. So just to say that definitely, I mean, the area of international human rights law and the UN Human Rights Council in particular has been an area of global governance in which China has become increasingly active, not only in terms of its institutional membership. I mean, China was re-elected as a member of the UN Human Rights Council back in 2020. You can still see on this slide that there has been declining support for China's membership between the 2016 election and the 2020 election. And we've also seen very much an activism of China in attempting to rewrite the norms and manipulating existing procedures, to quote 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗃 here, in the context of the UN Human Rights Council. But the point which I would also like to make here is that China's participation to the UN Human Rights Council is one of those instances where we've seen that China has had to face a kind of declining support. And here the kind of illustration which I wanted to mention is this declining support towards resolutions proposed by China in the context of the UN Human Rights Council, resolutions which China has proposed several times in 2018 and then in 2020 on so-called mutually beneficial cooperation in the field of human rights. This is obviously a very important field from the perspective of the European Union, and what we've seen in the last 3 years are indeed massive rounds of competition, contestation, and engagement between EU member states and China with regard to the situation in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. But the point which I would also like to make here is indeed the fact that the EU has been really struggling to come up and to speak up with one voice in that context, and that this competition, this contestation, and this opposition between the EU and China has primarily materialized at the level of EU member states and not at the European Union level. 30 seconds on my conclusions. So it is clear that China has adopted a diversity of strategies to confirm or contest the institutional and normative foundations of the international order. China increasingly acts as a rule maker and rule shaper in global governance, and no longer that much as a rule taker. it is very clear, and that's why I wanted to select those two cases on global investment governance and global human rights governance, that China has a potential to have a structural and long-lasting impact on a variety of areas of global law and governance. And the question, and I would like here to finish with a kind of question, is whether the EU is prepared, to quote Joe Biden, to enter into this so-called long-term strategic competition with China, which is the way the United States now describe the ways in which both the US and the EU will have to engage with China in the future. Thank you very much, and very much looking forward to hearing any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Matthieu, for giving us also a very insightful presentation, very rich. So we've now had 3 presentations, and we are now a bit more than halfway in this session 1. And as promised, we can have, let's say, 10 minutes Q&A exchange. I'm sure that these 3 stimulating presentations, after this presentation, you would like to ask some questions or comment on some of the points the speakers made. So do let me know if you have questions for Mike, Nadia, and or Matthieu. At the same time, I took a look at the chat box, of course. I don't see any questions. I hope there is no problems. I see someone asking me whether I can see the message from Joanna, and my answer is no, I can't. But I see that 𝗕𝗿𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗃 is raising his hand. So Ulrich, please, we can hear your question. Ulrich, just make sure that you are not muted, because we can't hear you now. If no, it can be a little later. Still, since there is a bit of silence, I can perhaps put forward 1 or 2 questions. Ulrich, time for you to work hard. Yes, Nadia. So Nadia is raising the physical hand. So more than the others, you can speak. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Yes.
Yes.
Now we can hear you.
Thank you. I would like to make a short comment. I think that the world is moving towards a new bipolarity, although limited, and this bipolarity has already existed in a blurred form, in a blurred shape before the pandemic. I'm speaking about the bipolarity between authoritarian capitalism led by China and liberal capitalism led by the United States. I think that this bipolar division will be more visible in the nearest future, although both poles were weakened by the pandemic. And the main question, although it's a rhetoric question, where Russia will be in this blurred and limited bipolarity. I'm sure that you know the answer. Russia in the current situation will be together with China. And I often hear from my colleagues why Russia is siding up with China, because China presents a threat to Russia. And I can give you a very simple answer. China presents an existential threat to Russia, given its integrated military and economic strategies. It presents an existential threat to Russia's territorial integrity. However, Russia does not present any threat to Russia's present political model. While with the European Union, it is vice versa. European Union doesn't present any existential threat to Russia, but the EU political model presents a threat to Russia's political model.
Well, thank you, Nadia. And before to invite our two other panelists perhaps to react and comment on that, I've seen some questions coming in from the chat box. So I'm going to share them with you. So we can collect a few questions, and then I will ask each of the three speakers to answer or react to any of these comments. So to start with, there are questions from 𝗖𝗵𝗶𝗶𝗃 from Mainz University, and as for Mike Smith. Mike, the question is, I just read, what do you understand by contestation? Also, who practices contestation? How and where and against what? And do you see a causal relationship between polarization and contestation? And she adds, domestic polarization, for instance, Trumpism in the US, involving societal actors, or international polarization, for instance, Hungary and Poland against EU, US against several international organizations, all that involving states and not actor states. Is that all parts of what you call polarization? Quickly, I have a couple of questions for Matthieu. And the questions are not from the chat box, but from me, Matthieu. I think that you made a very good analysis on the internal dimension. As you know, I'm sure, China's main annual political meetings, known as the two sessions, take place very soon, next month, in a few days, in fact, with the Chinese People Political Consultative Conference and the National People's Congress. So we know that the two sessions will prioritize the policy agenda for 2021, which is the first year of the 14th five-year plan. So can I ask you what you think we can expect? What do you think, or what do you expect from these two sessions in terms of domestic governance? And a quick follow-up, I mean, another question still for Matthieu on China, but this time on what you call the external dimension. It was very interesting what you said about the comprehensive agreement on investment. I'd like to know two things. What's the meaning you give to the absence of dispute resolution in that agreement? You highlighted such a lack of dispute resolution mechanism, but politically, what does that mean? And how much do you think it was a request on the part of China? You also said that the US might have been a factor in the rushed conclusion of the CEI late December. Possible. But what about the RCEP, the original Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which was not just concluded in principle, but which was signed on November 30. And in the RCEP, you find not only China, but also Japan, Korea, and a few other, if I may say, big guys. To me, it's very possible that the EU had an interest to rush the deal with China, not just because of the US. The US is, of course, one parameter. But the EU had an interest to neutralize a number of advantages that China is about to give to Japanese and Korean investors, which are not nothing, okay, in terms of investment competition. Okay, I've been too long. So back to each of you, perhaps we start in the order of the presentation. Mike, Nadia, if you want to chip in, and Matthieu again. And Mike, I have to remind you that we need you to unmute. You know, that's the buzzword for 2020 and 2021.
As I understand it, I have two questions. One of which you posed in your remarks after my presentation, and one of which came from, is it Joanna? On the question that you raised, which is how does the recommitment to multilateralism square with Biden's made in the USA stance? Well, I think you know, I think there's a sense in which this is all part of the Biden legacy, from Trump, which is, of course, that Trump, a lot of his support came from people who talked about making America great again and asserting US strength. And Biden, and he would probably have done this anyway, but his version of new international cooperation is based almost precisely on the regeneration of US strength. If you look at his speech to the Munich Security Conference, there was a very important paragraph which basically said, we're going to restore US strength, and that's going to be the basis for US leadership and cooperation under US leadership. Second point, I don't think you can divorce this from the electoral cycle in the US. In less than 2 years, there's going to be midterm elections, and in less than 2 days, some people think that Donald Trump is going to proclaim himself the Republican Party candidate for 2024. So I think, you know, those two things, the fact that rebuilding American strength has become part of the established American political agenda, and the fact that Biden is almost immediately into a new campaign against Trumpism, is part of the reason for that. And, you know, it squares with multilateralism in the American context, just as it did with Ronald Reagan or with various other leaders, in the sense that regenerating US strength at the domestic level is the precondition for regenerating American leadership in the multilateral arena. Right, second question. What do I understand by contestation? Well, I think I'm not necessarily the right person to answer this. I think Collier or somebody like that ought to be answering this. To my mind, it's contestation of values, institutions, status, the established order, challenges to the legitimacy, the effectiveness, and the credibility of those elements. Institutions, status, and values. And this can be formal or informal, it can be domestic or international. And the extent to which it relates to polarization is twofold, it seems to me. Number one, that there is a structural process of polarization going on in the international arena. Number two, that the contestation at the domestic level very frequently feeds through into challenges to the established order at the international level, and that the liberal order, as a result, is under challenge and will remain under challenge, because the EU-US initiatives are, in a sense, an attempt to restore EU-US leadership, depending on whether you think the US is the leader and the EU the follower, or it's a partnership. And this will generate counteractions or reactions in the changing structural nature of the international arena. I can't do any better than that. Collier, should I?
That's perfect, Mike. Thank you. Matthieu, would you like to answer the questions now? Or Nadia, would like to comment on any other aspects? I'm sorry, I haven't asked any question to you.
Nadia, please feel free to go
Matthieu.
first. I mean, it's what do you prefer? Should I start?
Your turn, Matthieu.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
all good.
please.
Thank you very much, Julien, for those two very challenging questions. And if I may, I'll start with the second one on the comprehensive agreement on investment, and focusing in particular on the absence of an effective dispute resolution mechanism and its political significance. I think the political significance is as follows. I mean, as I said, I think it would have been very difficult for the European Union to sell to its member states an old-style type of ISDS. I mean, we saw what happened, I mean, with the whole saga around the comprehensive agreement on trade between Canada and the European Union. One of the big issues was indeed old-style ISDS, and the fact that from the perspective of EU member states, that there was indeed a need to address the very shortcomings of traditional ISDS in terms of its lack of legitimacy, transparency, absence of an appeal system, and so on and so forth. So I think from the perspective of the EU, it was necessary sell, I mean, its reformed version of ISDS in the format of a kind of investment court system similar to the one you find, for instance, in the EFTA or in the CETA. But it is very clear there that China has not been supportive. China has not been supportive of this EU suggestion for an ICS-style dispute resolution mechanism. And what I would like to emphasize here, and for me, this is actually probably the main political significance of this absence of either an ISDS mechanism or an ICS mechanism, the main political significance relates again to the ratification process. Because I deeply believe that the ratification of the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, being as it stands now, an agreement falling under the exclusive competence of the EU and which will not require a green light from national parliaments and subnational parliaments, will make it way easier for the EU to get the agreement approved. If the agreement had fallen before the Walloon Parliament, to mention one of them, and to go back to what happened with the CETA saga, the whole debate would have been heavily politicized, and it would have been very difficult for the EU to reach out to get the green light of all national and subnational parliaments. And if I'm not mistaken, it should have been around 40 parliaments in total that should have given their green light to the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. Here, apparently, it won't be too difficult for the Council to get a qualified, to reach a qualified majority vote. And there is some contestation coming from the European Parliament and some groups in the EP in particular, but apparently it should not be too difficult to reach a single majority in the context of the EP. On the overall context, it is very clear that the RCEP has also, I guess, contributed to the acceleration of the process. But in that sense, I think it's also very much linked as well to the power transition in the US, in the sense that it was probably better or easier for the EU to justify the conclusion of this agreement, which testifies to a commitment to multilateralism of some sort, at a time where Trump was still very much in power, and before indeed the US would have by itself, I mean, to regain in a certain way some kind of legitimacy in the multilateral sphere by re-engaging in a constructive way with the World Trade Organization, by re-engaging in a constructive way with the Paris Agreement, you name them, right? So I think these issues are very closely linked with each other. Very briefly on your first question, I think that the upcoming meetings will be very much, to put it in a blunt way, about consolidating and affirming China's victory in terms of the fight against COVID, with China being at the moment very much of an outlier. And in a certain way, this kind of narrative, with China having been able to fight COVID apparently more successfully than a number of other regions of the world, will indeed, I mean, very much help consolidate what has been a process for a number of years, namely the consolidation of power in the hands of Xi Jinping and the standing committee of the Politburo. To put it in a very few words. Thank you very much again.
That's very good, Matthieu, and thanks for being blunt. I think you're right, but we'll keep an eye on that. So I keep an eye also on the time. So let me close this little Q&A here. I think it was very, very good to discuss with our three speakers. Now a little break, if I can call that a break. We will have further discussion at the end of session 1. So for now, let's turn to our let me just remind our next two speakers that they will also have a maximum of 15 minutes each for their presentations, which should leave us 20-25 minutes at the end for Q&A. So we are doing perfectly and very well on time. So it's my pleasure to introduce our fourth speaker for today, Professor Eduardo Svartman from Universidad do Rio Grande do Sul, who I understand is going to discuss the role of Brazil.
Well, thank you, Julian. Thank you, Kolja and Jan, for the invitation and the pleasure to share with you my views and this panel. Well, my presentation today could be called as between cooperation and contestation, the driving force of Brazil in international action. Well, I tried to make 4 blocks of my presentation. The first one trying to make a sort of frame to understand how Brazil is historically committed with rule-based international order. A second one where I tried to assess when and why Brazil acts as or mobilize some kind of contestation to the international order Brazil usually helps to build. A third block where I try to assess if we are living a new kind of contestation under the Bolsonaro government. And finally, try to see what's next, what lays ahead in times of pandemic and the transformations of the international global order. Well, my first point is try to highlight that Brazil is historically committed with a rule-based international order. Brazil was at the Hague Conventions, Brazil was at the League of Nations, Brazil was one of the foundation countries of the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, the OES, UNCTAD, World Trade Organization, and so forth. So, in this point, Brazil is not a newcomer. Brazil took part of a long process of building institutions and regions in the international system. Brazil performed, as many other countries, often overshadowed by the major powers. They played an important role in shaping the rules and giving legitimacy to many specific orders throughout the time. Well, what would be the driving forces behind this behavior? In the case of Brazil, it seems that this engagement, this cooperative engagement in the in building international orders is a way to grant governance and to avoid ingerence from the major powers. So that's why Brazil supported multilateral institutions for the international governance and at the same time uphold a strict understanding of sovereignty. The Brazilian understanding of sovereignty traditionally is based on the principles of non-intervention, self-determination, and peaceful resolution of conflicts. This long-standing feature of Brazilian foreign policy is usually understood as a means to pursue a larger margin of autonomy to the country. So Brazil doesn't have a mighty military power. Brazil not always is regarded as an economic powerhouse. So usually Brazil uses the principle of a rule-based international order and the institutions to protect himself from a very competitive and often violent international stage. But eventually, Brazil slightly acts as a promoter of some kind of contestation. It's important to notice that it's not a challenger or a contender, but pretty much more a reformist. Brazil never tried to overthrow the order, but to, let me say, to reform it in order to improve it. We have some examples of this behavior. We saw it in the 1970s when Brazil were very vocal, criticizing the No Proliferation Treaty, and also became more proactive in the engaging itself in the so-called North-South dialogue in the 70s. And also Brazil started to engage himself in what now we call the South-South diplomacy, especially towards Latin America, towards Africa, and towards the Middle East. In the 2000s, Brazil also became more vocal in with a discourse of reforming the international order. So Brazil became talk about the importance of democratization of governance institution, and became very vocal on promoting the reforming of the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, and also Brazil supported the creation of new forums and new organizations like the G20, the BRICS, and more close to us, UNASUR. Brazil also positioned itself in the international stage, vocalizing at that time, between 2005 and 2015, vocalizing the importance of the social development and the fact that the international institutions must aim social justice and promoting what was at that time someone called the Brasilia Consensus, opposing it as the Washington Consensus, with a more with a vision more focused on human development and not that much on only on growth or financial and economic performance. And finally, Brazil promotes this what we call a soft reformism, reinforcing its traditional concepts of sovereignty. It also was perceived when Brazil began to act more with more presence on peacekeeping operation and promoting international security, as with a so-called Brazilian way of conducting a peacekeeping operation. The major example of this is the Brazilian performance at Haiti, trying to mobilize also the other countries of South America and promote a more dialogue emphasis model of peacekeeping operation. Well, but the point is that when Brazil loses its economic leverage that we saw in the late 1970s and the 1980s with the debt crisis, and now the economic crisis we are going through, or when Brazilian political institutions fail to provide stability and domestic consensus, what we saw when we made our transition from the dictatorships in the late 70s to democracy in the 80s. And now, in the middle of the political crisis we are living from 2015, Brazil international influence is very strongly affected, in a way that Brazil usually restrains its international stance and tries not anymore to reform the order or to contest the order, but just to adapt to the present international order. Well, since 2015, as I said before, Brazil is living a very complex political and economical crisis that deeply is undermining its capacity to perform a major role in the international stage. However, and it brings me to the third block of my presentation, it seems we are living now a new kind of contestation of the international order under the presidency of Bolsonaro. If we take a look at Bolsonaro's foreign policy, we see a new far-right anti-globalization discourse. It's quite new. Usually, Brazilian foreign policy and foreign discourse is very engaged and in the international system, and regarding the multilateral system, also giving a high price to those institutions, even when is criticizing and trying to reform it, but it's usually values in a very high level those institutions, and with a traditional Brazilian discourse is very moderate. And not the case now under the Bolsonaro government. It's really a new rhetoric on how the country positioned itself abroad. We also, this new government has a very, very conservative approach on human rights issues on the United Nations, particularly, and under the Trump administration, the Bolsonaro government made a very tight alignment with the United States on issues that traditionally Brazil was not that close from of the United States. Issues regarding Cuba, the blockades on Cuba, regarding Venezuela and an intervention on the domestic affairs of Venezuela, on Iran, on the International Criminal Court, and of course on the way of tackling or not tackling the COVID-19 global crisis. Another important a feature of the Bolsonaro foreign policy is the hollowing out of the multilateralism, strong criticism, and especially regarding to UNASUR, who is practically a bad organization now, thanks to Brazil, who was the country that most engaged itself in the construction of this regional multilateral institution. And finally, Bolsonaro adopted a very confrontational stance with many international actors and agendas. We had a shameful Twitter war with President Macron of France. We have a lot of offenses directed to China, a very harsh approach with the World Health Organization, and a very complicated issue on climate change and environmental questions with the international press. So it's an ongoing process. We are in the middle of the government, but I'm trying to highlight to you what would be the driving forces of the Bolsonaro government that explain this behavior, this very awkward behavior regarding the traditional of the Brazilian foreign policy? The first point are the connections between the far-right activists in the United States and other countries and the domestic supporters of Bolsonaro. Usually, those actors and nowadays the Brazilian head of the diplomacy describes the UN and the European Union progressive agenda on human rights, climate change, gender equality as globalist, cultural Marxist conspiracy against nationality and Christianity. Well, the point is that the mobilization of this discourse has an important impact on Bolsonaro supporters. And as many populist leaders, Bolsonaro has no strong connection with the Brazilian party systems. At the present, he has no party. He was elected by one party, then he left this party last year. Tried to build another party, but it hasn't. So this direct communication with its supporters and the mobilization of this kind of discourse has an important capacity of interpellation with this audience. That's one of the driving forces of this foreign policy. The other driving force is kind of Cold War group thinking of his most closer advisors, most of them military, some of them retired, others not retired, where in their perceptions, we are not walking to a multipolar world, but we are walking to a bipolar world where the confrontation between the United States and China is inevitable. So Brazil must take a side, and this side is, of course, the United States. So very quickly, I have only 2 minutes now. What's next? It's very hard to predict. Something hasn't changed. It's important to note that Brazil did not walk away from Paris Agreement or from BRICS. So it's not a completely disruptive foreign policy. This foreign policy is highly contested domestically. And China, it's important to say, despite the alliance, the alignment with the United States, China is still the stronger and the most important commercial partner of Brazil. But other things have changed. Trump is gone, at least for a while, and COVID-19, as I told before, hit us very strongly. We have 250,000 deaths by now, and GDP contraction of 6%. So in the short time, Brazil cannot lead any serious contestation to any other. What we will probably see is that the conservative anti-globalist discourse will persist, although maybe in a lower tone. It will certainly make relations with European Union more costly. The case of the European Union Mercosur trade agreement, it's an example of that. It was signed, but many countries are denying the ratification. We will probably see an accommodation with the United States on issues regarding environmental, climate change, and so forth. And we'll probably see the alignment with the United States under the Biden administration remaining, especially regarding Russia and China presence in Latin America. And I can comment a lot about this later, because it has very important security consequences. So finally, it's important to keep in mind that Brazil is living a deterioration of its political institutions. The combination of protracted economic crisis, a global pandemic, and a far-right populist government is putting our democracy under heavy pressure. The outcome of this situation is yet unclear. However, we should not expect Brazil to be a proactive international actor for quite a while. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry to took too long. Thank you.
Obrigado, Eduardo. That's just fine. If I may, I'd like to squeeze in a comment for your action later in the Q&A. I feel also that Brazil's support to multilateralism that you explained could be illustrated by the role of Brazil at the WTO, at the World Trade Organization, to promote investment facilitation. I don't know if you have came across that, but some negotiations, they call that structured discussions, were launched at the WTO 1 or 2 years ago on this aspect. So it's not investment liberalization, but precisely I think it's meaningful to see what Brazil is doing, promoting, and it's in sharp contrast with what the US has done to the WTO. It's also interesting to see Brazil activism on investment facilitation, while investment treaties have been heavily contested by many countries in the world. So it would be great to have your views on that later on in the Q&A. So thanks again. We now turn to our fifth speaker, Dr. Joëlle Hivonnet, who is Minister Counselor at the EU Delegation to Guinea-Bissau, and she's a member of the European External Action Service. So bonjour, Joëlle, and I understand that Dr. Hivonnet will discuss the role of the EU.
Bonjour, or bon dia, I should say. If you'll allow me, before I start proper on what I want to discuss, and I will try and keep to my 10-15 minutes, maybe a few words about where I come from. I'm indeed a European official, currently working in Guinea-Bissau for the European External Action Service, but prior postings, I was involved in multilateral issues, and also I was for 4 years in the China division, and that's how I got to meet Matthieu. So of course, when I arrive somewhere like Guinea-Bissau, I tend to see it with with two pairs of glasses, multilateral glasses, to see what the UN is actually doing or can actually do, and also I pay particular attention to China. So in fact, what I want to do is tell you a little bit about what is happening in Guinea-Bissau, because I guess most of you have never heard of Guinea-Bissau. But I think it's interesting because through what is happening in Guinea-Bissau, I want to illustrate what's happening in West Africa and to some extent, in the rest of Africa. It's a bit presumptuous of me, I know, but this is what I'm going to try to do. So after this short introduction about what's happening in Guinea-Bissau, I want to concentrate on some of the global players that have been discussed today. I will mention Brazil and Russia, of course, but I will concentrate mostly on China and on Turkey. I mean, it's only Nadia, I think, that has mentioned Turkey, but not many colleagues are aware that Turkey is actually extending its influence in sub-Saharan Africa and is very present in West Africa. So, yeah, Guinea-Bissau, as some of you might know or might not know, is a small coastal country in West Africa, south of Senegal and north of Guinea-Conakry. It has a very small population of just under 2 million and a GDP per capita of around 800 euros a year. So that makes it one of the poorest countries on the planet. And yet it has great natural resources like fish, timber, bauxite, to name a few. It also faces many challenges, not least linked to sustainable development, which is lack of access to basic services, such as electricity, water and sanitation, medication, and a low level of education. But Guinea-Bissau is also facing a number of security issues linked to international organized crime. It's a platform for drug trafficking, but also is facing issues like human trafficking or the illegal exploitation of its natural resources, like fish, illegal fishing, wood and minerals. And since gaining independence from Portugal in 1974, Guinea-Bissau has experienced frequent political instability, including 4 coups d'etat and more than a dozen attempted coups, with the military playing a particular strong role in the country's political life. Since the civil war of 1988 and the 2012 coup, Guinea-Bissau has gone through multiple political crises. So in a nutshell, you see that already this is a vulnerable and fragile state. Since 2012, which was the date of the last coup, the UN Security Council has imposed targeted sanctions on the military involved in the coup. And last year, the EUCROSS force, known as 𝗕𝗵𝗶𝗃𝗀𝗃, actually left the country. And UNIOCBIS, which is a UN integrated peace-building office in Guinea-Bissau, was also closed on the 31st of December. So what we're seeing is basically regional and international organizations withdrawing from Guinea-Bissau, although of course there's still a very strong UN presence. And the fact that the UN Security Council will remain seized of the situation for at least another 2 years. In Bissau, we have our very own group of 5 that we call the P5, which is composed of the UN, the African Union, the EU, the Community of Portuguese language countries, and ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States, with the latter playing a particular active role. So the political situation is calm, but is fairly unstable since the last presidential elections in 2019 and the unexpected election of 𝗵𝗂𝘁𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗏. This new president is very keen to consolidate the powers of the president to the detriment of the democratically elected National Assembly. And in fact, we've seen growing tensions between the presidency on the one hand and the National Assembly on the other hand. The president also has a discourse that emphasizes the importance of the sovereignty of the country, which is something that he shares with what has been described by previous speakers. I'm thinking in particular of countries like Russia and China. And that is probably why he doesn't appear to be very keen on the role of the UN, other than as a provider of aid to development. So, for example, he really resents the tutelage of international organizations, and his latest mission is actually to bring the lifting of the remaining targeted UN sanctions. He's also resisting some of the reforms that have been requested by the UN and ECOWAS and the P5, for example, constitutional reform, justice reforms, or the reform of the security sector. He's also very keen to develop strong relations with emerging global powers. And that brings me to my second part, which is what are those big players in West Africa, and more particularly in Guinea-Bissau, and what are they doing? So all the big players that we've mentioned so far are here, and we have a few more as well. The picture is quite familiar. The US disengages or keeps a low profile. China arrives on the scene and inspires other players, whilst the EU is holding the fort. We're celebrating 45 years of diplomatic relations between the EU and Guinea-Bissau, and 45 years of presence in the country, but I can tell you that sometimes it feels very lonely. The US established diplomatic relations with Guinea-Bissau right after the independence in 75 and set up an embassy in 76. But when the civil war broke out in Guinea-Bissau in 1998, the US closed their embassy and they've managed their relations from the US embassy in Dakar. So that to say that, you know, US, although is still following what's happening in Guinea-Bissau, is still involved, you know, in particular in terms of trade relations, it's not very present. Maybe I'll say a few words also about Brazil, because, you know, Guinea-Bissau being a Portuguese-speaking country and the community of Portuguese-speaking countries having a role to play. Brazil is, of course, very present in Guinea-Bissau. You can tell by the size of the embassy and also the presence of the cultural center. And Brazil does enjoy some kind of privileged status in Guinea-Bissau. However, I think it's fair to say that ever since the pandemic, doesn't seem to be playing a major role. And I have to say that, at least on the ground, the strategy doesn't seem to be totally coherent, and they seem to concentrate more on cultural activities. A few words about Russia. Because of the revolutionary past of the country, and after the War of Independence, Guinea-Bissau has retained very close links, first with the Soviet Union and then with the Russian Federation. However, you know, there's also a very big diplomatic presence, but as is often the case, you know, Russia is very discreet. And I would like to say that compared to China and Turkey, for example, it doesn't seem to play such a major role in West Africa anymore. At least, you know, in Guinea-Bissau, it's not very visible. So now let's concentrate on the two big ones, and I'm sure that Matthieu will recognize what I'm about to describe. We have to bear in mind, first of all, that China is actually the country's largest creditor. So obviously that gives it some leverage. The president of Guinea-Bissau is trying to seek debt forgiveness from the IFIs and Portugal and China. But it will be very interesting to see what China does and how it responds to that request. It will come to you as no surprise that the Belt and Road Initiative has reached, you know, West Africa and is being unfolded quite successfully. And of course, what it does, it allows China to access various resources and to make sure that they can be exported back to China. By way of example, I want to mention illegal fishing by China. I want to mention illegal timbering from China. Mining resources is not very clear, but we think it's coming. And in return, you know, China is a classic case of China building much needed infrastructure. China, I have to say, has adopted a regional and very coherent approach when it comes to West Africa. In 2012, China and ECOWAS signed an agreement for the funding of a highway project linking the capital of Guinea-Bissau to other West African capitals. So that will be a 2,000-kilometer Trans-West African highway that will pass through Banjul, Bissau, Conakry, Freetown, Monrovia, Abidjan, Accra, Lomé, and Cotonou. And part of the highway is being built, or at least the building will start very soon after the demolition of some 400 houses and warehouses are on the way. I mean, I don't expect that China or maybe the government will provide rehousing for the people who will have been moved. So that was a highway project, but there's also a new railway line that is operating in the northern regions of Guinea-Conakry, which is one of the immediate neighbors of Guinea-Bissau. The railway link will lead to an alumina refinery in a city close to the border with Guinea-Bissau, 𝗕𝗵𝗶𝗃𝗍. And the transport of bauxite should start in June of this year. So the Chinese companies are building 135 kilometers worth of railways. And an international consortium, which is really 40% Singaporean and 23% Chinese, will operate the railway for 33 years before it is returned to Guinea-Conakry, since it's based there, but with ramifications to Guinea-Bissau. A few other examples. In 2005, China built the new National Assembly in Bissau. Since then, Chinese technicians have been taking care of the maintenance work. And in 2020, a partnership was signed between Guinea-Bissau and China to launch the refurbishment of the building. For the sake of being brief, I will mention in passing, the exploitation of some rare woods like rosewood, and the fact that China seems to have managed to lift a moratorium on logging that is really of concern to conversationists. And also, I want to refer to the fact that some Chinese nationals were recently arrested for illegal logging with links to the current Prime Minister of Guinea-Bissau. One last word, how successful China's mass diplomacy has been. Since June 2020, they've delivered something like 200,000 surgical masks, 15,095 masks, infrared thermometers, you name it. And the former health minister, as a result, declared that China was a valuable partner, always willing and ready to help Guinea-Bissau. Now, if I may, before I conclude, I would like to say a few words about the increasing presence of Turkey in sub-Saharan Africa and more particularly in West Africa. And what we saw recently on the 30th of January was the president of Guinea-Bissau and the president of Senegal, President Macky Sall, traveling together to Turkey in order to meet President Erdogan. It's not very clear what was discussed. We understand that security issues were discussed between the president of Senegal and Guinea-Bissau and president of Turkey. Turkey and Guinea-Bissau have a security cooperation agreement. We know that the Sadat Corporation conducts military training programs for many African forces and armies, including the National Guard. The trade volume between Turkey and Guinea-Bissau remains very limited, but recent cooperation agreements should see an enhanced Turkish presence in Guinea-Bissau. For example, they have signed an aviation agreement, and there are talks that Turkish Airlines will develop a connection also with Bissau. And one last point that is also interesting is the role of some of the Turkish schools that have taken over some of the low-level schools, and we're not quite sure what is happening in those schools. But I think the most successful element of the Turkish economic diplomacy is the provision of electricity in Guinea-Bissau and in neighboring countries. And what they do is there's a company that is called 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗃, and they've been building floating plants for almost 15 years by converting old freight ships and making it, the company, a leading player in industry, with a fleet of 25 power ships and unbeatable delivery times. It takes 60 days maximum to reach anywhere in the world. So, for example, the entire electricity of Bissau is generated by one of those ships. It's very polluting, of course, but it's very efficient. And then, as a result, Turkey has a very positive image in Bissau. Now, I would like to conclude very briefly, and I'll be happy to elaborate if there are any questions on what's happening in West Africa. So I would conclude by saying that we are witnessing some kind of new scramble for Africa by new global players. In this case, mostly China and Turkey. Two emerging, well, China is not emerging, but Turkey's case I think is quite interesting. Emerging players that have very little regard for democracy, rule of law, and human rights. But you know, they're really playing the card of economic diplomacy. However, our concern is that the exploitation of natural resources by the likes of Turkey and China is not sustainable. In many cases, it's highly polluting. But nevertheless, we've seen throughout Africa, and here I talk from as a result of conversations I've had with colleagues in the region, including in Senegal. What we've noticed in Africa is a growing criticism of Western democracies and democratic values, sometimes through the criticism of the European Union, as I've just mentioned, you know, in Senegal. So in other words, big players like China and to some extent Turkey seem to be winning the battle of narratives that is raging worldwide. So it's a battle that brings to the fore, in this case, the colonial past of many European countries and what is perceived as a failure of development cooperation policies. So beyond the defense of national interests by those big players like China and Turkey that really want to access natural resources, so what is at stake is the setting of alternative rules and norms that also contribute to undermining not just the EU, but also the role of the United Nations and the whole multilateral system. So that's what I wanted to say. And as mentioned previously, I would be more than happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Joëlle. I'd like to express our appreciation of your most interesting talk, really. It's now time for the second Q&A in this session one. So I'd like to leave to an audience that's full of expertise to direct questions, comments to our panelists. As we have 10 minutes left, let me just ask our 5 speakers to keep the answers as concise as possible. That means around 2 minutes, not more than that. I see some questions in the chat box, and in fact, a few answers. So I see questions for Nadia, Matthieu, Joëlle. I see also that some questions have been answered by Mike, for instance. So let me quickly organize this. Let me quickly organize the remaining questions in case you don't see them. And let me let me put some questions to Eduardo, Joëlle, Nadia, and Matthieu. That's what I have from the chat box. So for Eduardo, sorry, it was my question. So I just wanted to have your feedback on the role of Brazil at WTO and its meaning. To Joëlle, and perhaps to all, there's a question from Nino 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗃𝗍𝗍 asking what you and the panelists think about the prospects of BRICS and how does it influence the world order. Perhaps I could also add for you, Joëlle, how you think the BRI, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, is taking hold in Western Africa, and in particular, how much and to what extent the Chinese BRI can take precedence over US and EU in Western Africa. And for Nadia, again from the chat box, Nadia, in which thematic fields can we expect ongoing cooperation between Russia and the EU? And under which areas will rivalry obtain the upper hand? Can cooperation rivalry live side by side? Also, still for Nadia, as you explained, the political dialogue EU and Russia has come to perhaps a standstill since 2014 and the conflict in Ukraine. But isn't it possible to understand EU's approach as drifting away from the Russian leadership while trying not to disconnect from the Russian civil society and from the Russian people? Isn't it the only option for the EU in the short term? And now for Matthieu, the last few questions I've collected. Matthieu, you highlighted China's activism. And back to the recent investment agreements. What do you think is going to be the EU and China approaches and challenges in the next 2 years? Because the CAI, as you said, has been concluded in principle, which doesn't mean much. It means that there is no final text for now. So there is a lot of legal scrubbing, technical discussions, but also they will have to start ratifications. So it's very likely to take 2 to 3 years before we get anything tangible. So what do you think is going to happen in these coming 2 years? All right, that's the questions I have. I hope I don't miss anything. I see another one coming in. Let me just read it out. That's from Margarita Mironova, saying that principled pragmatism was mentioned as a guideline for the EU external action in the EU global strategy. What will be more principles or pragmatism in the EU post-COVID policy? And I think I can direct this question to all of you. Anyone wants to answer can do so. For the answers, can we start with Eduardo and Joëlle, so that they have a bit more time than Matthieu and Nadia, who already had a chance to answer earlier.
So thank you, Julien, for the question. Very quickly, the investment facilitation initiative within the World Trade Organization was an initiative aiming to risk mitigation, governance and cooperation on investments with some practical measures. It is an example of the professional and high, well-trained diplomatic corps of Brazil. And the traditional strategy Brazil used to promote its interests, particularly in this case, its enterprises, trying to create rules, trying to engage different partners, and establishing an institutional set where all the partners can move, and all the partners can must obey the rules. So some of the Brazilian limitations could be compensated once all the countries are forced to obey the rules. So it's at the same time, it's an example of cooperative engagement and of strategic projection of its national interests or private interests. So very quickly, thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Joëlle?
Thank you. So if I may, I will deal very briefly with 3 questions that have been asked. The first one is on principle pragmatism. Second one is there was a question to me from Kolia about the EU being more strategic, and the last one I think is the prospect of BRICS. So I will start with that last one. Because when I was working in the China division, we paid a lot of attention to this grouping of BRICS. And to start with, people were very dismissive. They were saying, oh, BRICS, you know, it's mishmash, it's a marriage of convenience. Yeah, it's a marriage of convenience, but it is a marriage, you know, and some of those marriages of convenience, as we know, they tend to last longer. The other thing that people were saying, yeah, but, you know, in this grouping, China is the major partner, and the other ones, especially Russia, is probably more of a junior partner. That may be so, and this is exactly how it is unfolding, for example, in West Africa. What we're seeing is that it's no longer about BRICS, you know, it really is about China, and how China has used the informal grouping actually to move ahead, in particular with the Belt and Road Initiative. On the question of how can the EU be more strategic, well, we see what is happening as usual. How you address it is very complicated. We're trying to put a lot of emphasis on what is known as public diplomacy, which is basically trying to produce a counter-narrative so that people are more aware of what it is that the EU is doing and what the EU is standing for. But I have to say that it is a major battle, because in a country like Guinea-Bissau, what people want is they want electricity, they want water, they want to see education for their children. We have many projects, but somehow, once again, what seems to be lacking is also the visibility that will help us to capitalize on this. And also, and that will be, you know, my answer to this issue of principled pragmatism. I think we are waged to this issue of principles and values. And I think we will not see a situation where pragmatism, in my view, I don't think we see a situation where pragmatism overrules, you know, our defense of values. And I think maybe it's good. Maybe I'm pleased that, you know, the EU will continue to stand for universal values, but it's a struggle, and we sincerely hope that the US might be back on board to also help us, because we need all the help that we can get.
Good luck, Joëlle. Nadia, and Matthieu at the end.
Well, I think that European Union and Russia depend on each other in many areas, in many spheres, including energy, trade, financial sector, and security. But interdependence is good when the relations between partners are good. When these relations are worsening, the interdependence becomes an additional problem. But when relations are very bad, like now, again, interdependence starts to play a positive role, because it is the last resort when relations are very bad. The problem with the European Union that it does not have any common agenda on the Russian direction, because it is deeply split. The Baltic states and Poland are in favor of more are in favor of tough sanctions against Russia. France, Germany, Franco-German tandem has a different approach. Germany is interested in Nord Stream 2. France wants to involve Russia in discussions about European security. So there is no one common agenda vis-à-vis Russia. And of course, rivalry, I have this question, can cooperation and rivalry live side by side? Yes, they can live side by side. And Russia is interested in bilateral cooperation with the EU member states, because Russia is always stronger in these bilateral relations. So my point is that we need a common agenda in the EU strategy vis-à-vis Russia. And there was a question about Ukraine. I think it's a very important question. Of course, Ukraine could become a new area of cooperation if we agree, if Russia and European Union agree on the peacekeeping operation in Ukraine, because it's the only way to end this creeping conflict and to create conditions for political solution. Unfortunately, the EU and the West at large looks at the format of this peacekeeping cooperation from a different angle, and it is interested in the peacekeeping cooperation inside Eastern regions, which is impossible.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Nadia. Sorry, we need to keep an eye on the time, and we still have Mike and Matthieu. Can I invite Mike to make a brief comment, and then Matthieu will have 30 seconds at the end.
Yeah, very, very briefly. First of all, I agree with Joëlle about the BRICS. I think it's about China, and I think that's a reflection of the changing structure of the global order in a more general sense. Secondly, on principled pragmatism, the word that really springs out of the page in lots and lots of recent EU documents is assertiveness. And my view is that the more you're assertive, the more the tension between principles and pragmatism will become apparent. And, you know, that's going to be one of the difficulties. But then again, we'll come back to that this afternoon, maybe.
Thank you, Mike. Matthieu, 20 seconds.
You're really a tough chair, Julien. So just a few, I'll be very brief. So on the comprehensive agreement on investment, what will happen in the coming 2 years? At the EU level, I believe that member states will kind of test the waters and search for alliances in a context where the push for the conclusion of the agreement came to a large extent from a limited number of states, including Germany, with therefore the question of where the politicization is likely to take place. As I said, the debate is likely to be politicized in the European Parliament, but there might be some kind of issues bridging, and we've seen that already, for instance, with a number of member states of the EU reconsidering the bilateral extradition treaties they have with China. And I think there is the question of whether there might not be a pressure for the EU to reconsider the comprehensive agreement on investment in view of some developments taking place in China. From the EU perspective, also the EU will have to kind of solve the potential conflicts between the comprehensive agreement on investments and existing BITs between the PRC and EU member states, BITs between EU member states and China, which were very much of an old style generation. And if I may, just one last point to answer your question, Julien, and this relates, let's say, in particular to the dispute resolution mechanism. I believe that the ongoing negotiations on ISDS or any kind of investment protection mechanism to be included in the 𝗔𝗍𝗍 will also very much depend on the evolution of discussions taking place in Working Group 3 of UNCITRAL, dealing with ISDS reforms, because if some progress was to take place there, this could indeed also feed into the ongoing negotiations between the EU and China on the investment protection mechanism. So it was 35 seconds, I guess, but thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Matthieu. It was truly excellent. I truly enjoyed this presentation, really fantastic. We could go on. I'm very sorry for rushing you a bit towards the end, but we took an extra 5-10 minutes on the program. I hope the organizers will forgive me for that. But I'd like to thank again all our speakers for their very interesting and stimulating contribution. It's really be fantastic time management too. Thanks also to the participants for valuable discussion and questions. So I think it's time to close this session 1. Let me remind you that we will reconvene for the second session after my dinner in Hong Kong, which on the program, we will reconvene at 2:30 p.m. Central European time. So in a bit less than 1 hour, I think. So thank you. Back to you, Kozia. You are muted. Okay, bye-bye.